So, moving on to part 4, this will be chapter 16 in Phoner. That's for you folks at home. Everybody else here, this is again part 4 of the, first unit of the new semester. So, we've been talking about big businesses. Now we're going to have to start regulating them. You've seen the effects of strikes on certain businesses. You've seen some of the ways they've treated workers so far, if you've read ahead. But anyway, now we're actually going to talk about, here's some reasons why they have to regulate them, other than the fact that they were making a lot of money that went unchecked. So, the first form of regulation that comes to anybody that is involved in these multi-billion-dollar businesses is going to be the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Sherman Antitrust Act comes about as a result of government fearing these expanding corporations, to the point where you have certain politicians that don't want to have anything to do with trying to clamp down on these places, because they can leave these states and go elsewhere and take their money with them. Okay? So states get rich off of it, of course the government gets rich off of it. Now, the reason why they started doing this is because there were unfair business practices, and some people said this infringed upon their rights to run a business. So in 1890, this law called the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed. What it did is it made it illegal to form a trust, much like Standard Oil, in which they had multiple boards running one company or running several companies, and then, collaborating together to form a monopoly. And they said it was illegal to form a trust that interferes with free trade between states or other countries. It's hard to enforce because the word trust is not clearly defined in the law. And then also it's hard to enforce because nobody really wants to step in from the government, because a lot of these people are getting paid off by these companies. Okay? Now, the key word in there is free trade. That will come back in just a second when we're going to talk about unions. Okay? Now, also, companies could reorganize their structures, still be illegal, and delay investigations. So basically, if they were like, we are going to investigate you for having this trust, because we see that this company and this company are working together, you say, okay, let's reorganize really quick, and you can change the stuff on paper, and you can change who's in charge of what, and all of a sudden it looks like you have a different company. Okay, but still be illegal. And the government would not investigate after that. Okay, now, that's true up until about 1900, whenever Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. They started investigating them pretty hefty. Okay, so 7 out of the 8 cases that were brought before the Supreme Court were thrown out under the original law. And again, it's after Theodore Roosevelt comes into office, they start actually going after him. I'm pretty sure Roosevelt broke up right around 40 trusts within his 8 years in office. So, anyway, after that, since the Supreme Court throws out most of these cases, they stop trying to enforce this law. However, remember I said something about interfering with free trade within that law? That's how the law actually is turned on the workers. So they try to, what actually happens here is companies use this law and they say our workers are on strike, we're not able to produce anything, we're not putting anything out, so they're interfering with free trade. And the courts actually side with this and use this as lawsuits to break up strikes. Okay, which is not what the law was intended to do in the first place. Okay, so, anyway, like I said, it interferes with free trade and interferes with interstate commerce. Most of the first cases tried under the Sherman Antitrust Act are used against unions, which we'll talk about unions here in just a second. Okay, now, a little note here on the South, in terms of industry, the South is still agricultural. Most of the industry is still in the North, so we have not changed that since the Civil War. The South still has zero money to invest in business because they're still hurting from the Civil War. Northerners that are in the South own 90% of the businesses down there, and they own 90% of the most profitable businesses, I should say. Most of those Southern companies are entirely agricultural. The only thing that gets the South out of debt is they have a lot of coal. They are able to grow tobacco pretty well. And then also they still rely on textiles and cotton. Okay, so with those things, they're able to overcome this and arrange agreements with the North so that way they can get a little bit of prosperity down there. Okay, now here's the big part of today: the unions. Okay, working conditions are terrible at this point in time. You also had kids that were working in these places, and I'll talk about them here in just a second. But in terms of poor working conditions, things are dangerous. There are no covers over these gears and these other mechanisms in a factory. You can get caught in one pretty quick, and it's not just you're going to get stuck in one. It could take your clothes and actually crush you using the pressure from your clothes. Clothes didn't tear. Excuse me. It also, in terms of, because these things are exposed, they frequently broke down. In order to get things out of the gears, they would have little kids go in, because they have smaller arms and legs, get these things out of the gears. What they didn't realize is a lot of pressure builds up on these gears, and they release whenever whatever's taking out, it stops them. And a lot of kids lost limbs as a result of that. Some of them were actually killed. Okay, in the steel industry, and sorry, they also have week-long work requirements. I believe Carnegie Steel only took off the 4th of July. They worked Christmas, they worked Thanksgiving, so on and so forth. They also had low wages. They did not pay people a livable wage. As you will see next chapter, whenever I start talking about a guy named Jacob Rees, he takes a photo in New York of a room full of about 15 people sleeping in one apartment. And that's whenever people start realizing, yeah, they're not paying a livable wage, maybe we should raise wages on this. So the first industry to see any unions was the steel industry. Does anybody know what a union does? Brings everybody together, like you just said, with your hand motion. Okay, what else? Yep.
Doesn't it give workers benefits?
Yeah, it can help negotiate benefits for workers, and it can help better working conditions. If you don't like something and you're part of a union, instead of you just walking out and saying, I'm done until this is fixed, because you'll get fired in that case, if a union walks out and says, we're not doing this until it's fixed, a little harder to fire the workers. They're very controversial, and again, I'm not going to say if I'm pro-union, anti-union, or whatever, but they're very controversial because they are involved in politics. They are sometimes involved with organized crime. They are also, at this point in time, involved with socialism. Okay, so anyway, back in the day, about 675 people per week are killed on the job in job-related accidents in the United States. This is in the 1890s. We don't even kill 675 in a year now. Okay, so that was per week. Children were frequently killed or injured. As I mentioned before, there was no minimum age to work. Usually if you were 4 or 5 and you were able to speak, you got put to work. Okay, so they put you in there just so you could get some money. Kids, it was about 20% of boys under the age of 15 and 10% of girls held full-time jobs in the cities. And this also starts due to northern wages being more than those in the South. And so you see a lot of people that work in the South put their kids to work first. Okay, so women also decided to organize pretty early on because they were paid 1/2 of what a man is at that point in time. Okay, and going back to the 1860s, in the United States, the first large-scale union was the National Labor Union. Okay, that National Labor Union didn't have a specific industry that they looked at. It was just if you're working and you want to be part of this organization that will have people go speak on your behalf, called arbitrators, or they sit down with the company and try to negotiate with the company, you can join this organization. They did not allow African Americans in. So at that point in time, in 1868, there was something called the Colored National Labor Union that formed. They were the first ones to allow African Americans to be part of that. Okay. From there, a very famous union comes about called the Knights of Labor. And there are still elements of the Knights of Labor left over to this day. Some of your parents, if they work in industry, may be a part of that one. There are no limits on job, race, gender, or skill as a result of that union. Then you also get something called craft unionism, okay, where you have people in multiple types of job skill sets in one union. So this is like electrical workers, steel workers. Okay, if you specialize in something, you can be part of that one, okay, or a different union like that. There are all kinds of unions today as a result of this kind of stuff. There was one back then, Samuel Gompers. He was actually a very famous leader that started something called the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. Okay, that organization still exists. Originally, it organized people making cigars, because each town used to have its own individual cigar making factory, or each major city did. Along with that, he was the one that called for using strikes as a tactic for raising wages. He also wanted to shorten workday, and he wanted to address safety concerns. Nowadays, with these unions, Pretty common ones, you actually see this in major advertising in bigger cities, electrical workers, auto workers, there are teachers' unions, they're even talking about creating fast food unions. Okay, Google in Kansas City, there are people that work on the fiber network, they just unionized or requested a union within the last week. Okay, so that way they can bargain with the company and address mostly these things right here. Okay, so I mentioned socialism is tied to these unions. If you don't know what socialism is, it's basically where you propose the government has more of a say in the economy and the government can influence the economy. Okay, there are things such as socialized medicine where the government takes over hospitals and people who practice medicine, and they can set prices, they can set wages, and a lot of people are okay with that because they think it levels the playing field, it makes things a little more fair. Other people say that interferes with the free market economy and makes it to where you can't earn your maximum amount that you want to earn, okay? But anyway, back then, these people that are calling for socialism wanted to mostly even the playing field as far as income, and they wanted, like I said, to have more government control over businesses and the overall economy. Because people like John D. Rockefeller, we have something called the, I guess, gross domestic economy, where you take the entire economy of one nation. He comprised 3% by himself with his companies of the entire economy of the United States. And some people took an issue with that, okay? So, one of the leading figures of this, and you'll hear about him again in World War I because he spoke out against the war and actually got thrown in jail, is this guy named Eugene Debs. He is a socialist union organizer who formed the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, that still exists, but he is a known socialist. He actually ran for president as a socialist, okay, which some people would frown upon that nowadays. It was really frowned upon back then, okay? So he advocates for distribution of wealth, where you took money from the wealthy and you used that or you took taxes from the wealthy, use that to build up a welfare system, okay? Especially for the immigrants and the poor. That IWW, like I mentioned before, it's still a union that exists. So anyway, immigrants would organize their own unions in the West. They hope for equal treatment as Americans. Didn't exactly work out there. Now, these multiple violent strikes. Talk a little bit about Homestead, in which Carnegie's workers were shot at and killed by the Pinkerton detectives. But on these other violent strikes, there was one up in Chicago in which an anarchist, or a group of anarchists, planted a bomb that went off and killed 8 people. And they started investigating as to who was part of this. Come to find out it's an anarchist movement. Anarchy means you do not believe in government and you want government to collapse. Well, this killed several police officers and several people that were on strike up there, and it exposed the fact that there were anarchists and socialists within unions in the United States, made them even more controversial at that point in time. Okay, some other people that you need to know. Mary Harris, her nickname was Mother Jones. She is going to help persuade politicians to end child labor. Reason why we have several laws that now state you must be of a certain age in order to get a job at various places, and there are certain exceptions for people that are 14, but most of the time you have to be 15 or 16 in order to get a job. Reason for that is because she actually marched to the president's personal house, not just the executive mansion, as they called it at the time, or as we now call it, the White House. Actually went to, I believe, Theodore Roosevelt's personal house in New York City and said, hey, we need to fix this, and he was very impressed with her delivery on that and helped end child labor after that, okay? So, unions basically tried to take care of the adults. Sherman antitrust tried to break up the businesses. Child labor comes about as a result of various individuals picketing politicians, okay? Other things that help to draw the interest of the public. This is actually after the era that we're talking about, but this is something that helps bring about workplace safety and workplace regulations. If you've ever heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, okay, that took place as a result of it was a can of rags that were soaked in some sort of chemical, spontaneously combusted. There were no fire escapes, and there was no way for people to crowd onto the elevators to get off the floors that were on fire. It wound up killing 146 women. Okay, that drew the attention of politicians and drew the attention of the nation. They said, we need to make factories a little more safe. So now we have the OSHA, okay, or the Occupational Safety Hazard Association. They will come in and say, this is unacceptable for the workplace, you need to fix this so your workers don't get hurt, okay? Now, along with that, going back to the unions really quick, those unions became popular somewhat, okay? It's only a small percentage of workers that actually join a union, but they became very powerful, we'll just say that, okay? As unions rose in popularity, businesses came to either fear them, some embraced them, most of them feared it, okay? A lot of people wouldn't hire union workers. Other people had to sign a contract saying they would not join a union whenever they got hired at a certain company. And again, the Sherman Antitrust Act is used against those unions in order to end strikes. So unions still have a very big role in terms of politics. It's a big deal, like if the Teamsters Union, which is the one that has 2 horse heads and a wheel on it, and I think there's an office over on just off of 7th Street in Joplin. If the Teamsters endorses a presidential candidate, usually they endorse Democrats, but if they endorse a presidential candidate, they tend to get a lot more donations to them through various aspects, okay? So, anyway, that is going to conclude this part of the lecture series on Chapter 16.